Story 1 credited to Ethan Wells. You know how sometimes you get a feeling, like deep in your gut, telling you something isn't right? I've had that feeling a handful of times in my life, but never like this. It was a Saturday, and it was hot. My girlfriend Sarah and our friend Ben had been planning to hit up Crescent Point Beach for weeks. It wasn't one of those touristy spots you see on postcards, more of a local place, quiet, out of the way. If you weren't from the area, you'd probably never even know it existed. And that's what I liked about it. No crowds, no screaming kids, no overpriced snacks, just peace. When we pulled into the parking lot, the first thing I noticed was how empty it was. On a normal summer weekend, you might expect it to be quiet, but this quiet? Only 2 cars. One looked abandoned, covered in sand like it hadn't moved in days. The other was this old, beat-up station wagon. Empty, no sign of its owner. I glanced at Sarah, and she shrugged. Ben, of course, didn't think twice. He popped the trunk, grabbed his cooler, and joked, "We've got the whole place to ourselves." We headed down to the beach, and I was trying to shake this weird feeling I couldn't put into words. The air felt heavy, the way it gets before a storm, even though the sky was perfectly clear. And there was this smell. It wasn't the usual salty ocean breeze. It was metallic, like rust, like blood. "Do you smell that?" Sarah asked, wrinkling her nose. "Probably just seaweed or something," I said, though I wasn't convinced. The wind was picking up a little, making the dunes shift around us as we laid out our towels. I tried to relax, but my eyes kept drifting to the horizon. The waves looked too controlled. I know that sounds crazy, but they were crashing at these perfect intervals, one after another, almost rhythmic. Something about it didn't feel right. Ben, as usual, didn't notice a thing. He was too busy messing around with his phone, scrolling through something, probably Instagram. Sarah started reading a book, and I forced myself to stare up at the sky, telling myself I was overthinking things. But that feeling wouldn't go away. It felt like we shouldn't be there. About an hour later, Ben stood up, squinting toward the water. "Do you guys see that?" he asked. I followed his gaze, and at first I didn't see anything. But then, as my eyes adjusted, I noticed what he was talking about. Shoes. Dozens of them, scattered along the shore, just out of reach of the waves. "Where did those come from?" Sarah said, her voice tight. I stood up, my heart racing for no reason I could understand. There were all kinds. Flip-flops, sneakers, even hiking boots. Some half buried in the sand, others neatly placed like someone had just taken them off. I'm not going to lie, something about the sight of them chilled me to the bone. I mean, shoes, right? Not exactly terrifying. But there was something wrong with how they were just there. As if they'd been left behind in a hurry. Ben was already walking toward them, his phone out, probably thinking it would make a great post or something. "Maybe it's some kind of art thing," he said, but he didn't sound convinced. I hesitated, but Sarah started walking too, so I followed, trying to make sense of it. There was no one else on the beach. No signs of people, no sounds except the wind and the waves. And yet, there were these footprints. Just one set, leading from the shoes toward the dunes, but they looked fresh. Recent. "Maybe we should head back," I said, my voice coming out more uneasy than I intended. Ben ignored me, picking up one of the shoes, a tiny white sneaker, the kind a little kid would wear. "This is creepy, right?" he finally said, looking between me and Sarah. I nodded. "Yeah, let's get out of here." We turned to leave, and that's when I heard it. This low, rhythmic sound, almost like chanting. It was so faint I thought it was my imagination at first. But Sarah froze next to me, her eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Ben looked around, his face pale now, and I could tell he heard it too. It was coming from the dunes. Slowly, I turned, and standing there at the edge of the sand was a figure. I couldn't make out any details through the sun and the blowing sand, but it was definitely watching us. "We should go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. No one argued. We grabbed our stuff and made our way back to the car as fast as we could without breaking into a run. My heart was pounding, and I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting the figure to follow us. But when we got to the parking lot, everything was still. No cars, no figure, no sound. Just that eerie silence hanging in the air. We didn't say much on the drive home. I think we were all trying to process what had just happened, but none of it made sense. Shoes don't just appear out of nowhere. People don't just vanish. But that's the thing about Crescent Point. It's always been a quiet place, a place where you can disappear and no one would notice. Story 2, credited to Tom Harding. It was late August, one of those days where the heat hits you before you even leave the house. I'd been working overtime all summer, and when Mike called me up and said, "Hey, let's get out of town for a day, hit the beach," I didn't think twice. It was me, Mike, and his girlfriend Rachel. She wasn't thrilled about going to a beach in the middle of nowhere, but she came along anyway. We drove about 2 hours out of the city to this place called Haven Cove. Mike found it online. It's supposed to be one of those hidden gems that no one knows about. The drive there was weird. We didn't pass many cars, and as we got closer, the road turned from asphalt to dirt. It felt like we were heading straight into the middle of nowhere. When we pulled up, the place looked deserted. I mean, there wasn't a soul in sight, just endless sand and the ocean stretching out like it was waiting for something. Mike seemed excited. "We've got the whole place to ourselves," he said. But Rachel didn't seem as enthusiastic. She stood there, looking around, fidgeting with the hem of her dress. I didn't think much of it at the time. I figured she was just bored. So we set up near the dunes, threw down a couple of towels, cracked open some beers. I remember it felt too quiet, though. There wasn't the usual background noise you'd expect at a beach. No seagulls, no other people, just the sound of the waves. But even they seemed muted. About half an hour in, Rachel stood up and said she wanted to take a walk. I thought it was a little strange. She seemed uneasy. But Mike waved her off, said she probably needed some space, so we let her go. We stayed back, throwing a football around, talking about nothing in particular. I don't know how long it was before we realized something was wrong, but eventually Mike stopped mid-throw. "Hey, where's Rachel?" he asked. I turned around, scanning the shoreline. She wasn't anywhere. I thought maybe she'd walked up ahead or behind the dunes, but the more we looked, the more it hit us. She was gone. I yelled out her name, but there was no answer. Mike started running down the beach, calling for her, and that's when I noticed something odd. Her footprints. They stopped. About 50 yards from where we were sitting, they just stopped in the sand leading toward the water. We didn't have cell service out there, so we couldn't call anyone. Mike started panicking, his voice cracking as he called her name again and again. We scoured the beach, shouting and running back and forth, but Rachel was gone. It was like she'd vanished into thin air. Mike waded into the water, yelling that she must have gone for a swim, but I knew that didn't make sense. She hadn't said anything about going into the water, and Rachel wasn't a strong swimmer. I tried to keep it together, but the longer we went without finding her, the more my mind raced. Maybe she fell, maybe she got caught in a riptide. But there was no sign of a struggle, no sound, nothing. After what felt like hours, we gave up searching and raced back to the car. We drove to the nearest gas station, about 30 minutes away, and called the police. By the time they arrived back at the beach, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the sand. They searched for hours, into the night and the next day, but they never found her. They interviewed us both, went over every detail a dozen times, but nothing added up. No one saw anything, there were no witnesses, and there was no evidence. The only thing left were those footprints leading straight into nothing. They filed it as an accidental drowning, but we all knew that didn't feel right. Mike and I haven't talked much since that day. I don't think he can handle it. Sometimes I wonder if I missed something. If there was a sign, something I didn't pick up on. But when I go back over it in my mind, it always comes down to the same thing. Rachel's gone, and we'll never know why. I don't go to beaches anymore. Story 3, credited to Chris Donovan. It's strange how some places can feel wrong, even when everything about them looks fine on the surface. You ever get that feeling? Like your body's trying to warn you about something your brain can't quite understand yet? That's what happened to me, and it still haunts me to this day. This was about 2 summers ago. My friends and I had planned a beach trip, nothing big, just a weekend away from work, away from the grind, and maybe to catch up with each other since we were all drifting apart after college. It was me, my girlfriend Katie, my best friend Jared, and Ryan, another friend from high school. We were all in our mid-20s, and honestly, the thought of a weekend away seemed perfect. We'd all been working crazy hours and we hadn't hung out in months. We decided to hit Driftwood Beach, a secluded spot a few hours from home, somewhere we'd all been before when we were kids. It wasn't a popular spot like those tourist beaches with ice cream trucks and screaming kids. Driftwood Beach was kind of off the grid. You had to know where it was, tucked away down this narrow, winding trail that cuts through dense woods. If you didn't grow up around here, you'd never know it existed. We got there early in the morning, around 8 a.m. The sun was already climbing, and the air smelled salty and fresh. For a second, I thought, the sand stretched out ahead of us, the water was calm, and we were the only ones there. You could see these giant, weathered pieces of driftwood scattered along the shore, like bones from some ancient sea creature washed up long ago. But there was something off. I could feel it almost right away, like a weight in the air. At first, I thought it was just me, maybe nerves or stress from work. But as we got closer to the beach, Katie grabbed my arm and whispered, "Do you feel weird?" I did, but I shrugged it off. "Weird how?" I asked. "I don't know," she said. "Like, we shouldn't be here." Ryan and Jared were already hauling the cooler and bags down to the sand, so I didn't think too much of it. I just smiled at her and said, "We're fine, it's just quiet, let's set up." We laid out our towels, popped open a few beers, and started relaxing. The first hour was normal, just us hanging out, talking about work, Jared telling some dumb story about his boss at the tech firm. But as the morning went on, that weird feeling didn't go away. In fact, it started getting worse. The beach was too quiet. Like, too quiet. No birds, no wind. Even the waves, which should have been crashing against the shore, felt muted, like someone had turned down the volume. Katie kept glancing at the water, and after a while I started to notice it too. There was barely any movement. It was like the ocean had slowed down. We tried to ignore it. I mean, we were there to have a good time, right? But after a while it was impossible to relax. By noon I was already thinking about heading back. That's when Jared suggested we go for a swim. "I don't know, man," I said. "The water looks off." Ryan laughed and slapped my shoulder. "You scared of a little ocean? Come on, dude, we drove 3 hours for this." Katie looked uncomfortable, but Jared was already running toward the water, so I figured, what the hell. The second my foot hit the water, though, I regretted it. It was freezing, way colder than it should have been for mid-June. But Jared, being Jared, kept going, diving in head first, splashing around like a kid. "Come on," he shouted, waving us over. Katie stayed on the shore, but Ryan and I waded in. I could tell Ryan wasn't feeling it either, even though he was trying to act tough. The water felt heavy, like it was pulling at us, and after a few minutes, I headed back to shore. That's when I noticed it. There was something in the water, a shape maybe 30 or 40 yards out, just standing there. At first, I thought it was some kind of weird optical illusion. You know how the water can sometimes play tricks on your eyes? But as I squinted, I could see it more clearly. It wasn't a rock. It wasn't a piece of driftwood. It was a person. Just standing there, half submerged, motionless. "Katie, do you see that?" I asked, pointing. Her face went pale and she nodded slowly. "What is that?" Jared, who had been splashing around like an idiot, suddenly stopped. He stood up, water dripping down his face, and stared out at the figure. For a moment, none of us moved. "Hey!" Ryan shouted, waving his arms. "Hey! You good?" No response. The figure didn't move, didn't turn toward us. Nothing. "I'm not messing with that," Katie muttered, grabbing her towel and wrapping it around herself. Something about the way that person just stood there. It was wrong. I can't explain it, but everything in me was screaming to get out of the water. "We should go," I said, my voice low. Jared didn't argue. In fact, he was already heading back to shore, moving faster than I'd ever seen him move. We packed up quickly after that, throwing things into bags without saying much. The whole time, I kept glancing back at the water, but the figure was gone. Just like that. No ripples, no sign of them. They were just gone. The hike back to the car was dead silent. No one said a word. Katie was practically glued to my side, and Jared had this far-off look like he was deep in thought. Even Ryan, who's usually the joker in the group, was quiet. We got back to the cabin we'd rented around 5 p.m. The mood had shifted. No one was joking around anymore. Katie went straight to the bathroom saying she felt nauseous, and Ryan and Jared sat down in front of the TV, but neither of them seemed to be watching it. I tried to shake off the feeling of dread that had been building all day, but it stuck with me. Around 8 p.m., Katie still hadn't come out of the bathroom. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. "Katie," I called, my voice louder now. Still nothing. I tried the handle. It wasn't locked. When I opened the door, she was sitting on the floor, knees pulled to her chest, staring at the wall. "They're watching us," she whispered, her voice shaking. "They're still watching." I froze. "What are you talking about?" Her eyes flicked toward me, wide and terrified. "The person in the water, they're not gone. They followed us." I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to respond to that. But something told me she wasn't wrong. We didn't stay the full weekend. In fact, we left early the next morning. Jared barely spoke the entire drive back, and Katie just kept looking out the window, her eyes distant. I don't go to the beach anymore. Not that beach, not any beach. I can't. And sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night, I swear I can still hear the sound of those slow, deliberate waves. And I wonder if they're still watching.